This is basically the layout for the center of our quilt. You can swap your 6.5-inch unfinished blocks around however you want them to an arrangement you like. You can also swap around your 12.5-inch blocks. You could mirror image the whole thing, but then your duck would be looking off the quilt. So I'm going to show you how I'm putting it together as I go. So as I get a section done, then I will come back and show you on the video. These are the sections I've sewn together so far. So I sewed the top and the bottom rows together in one long row. And then the two sides are sewn together in vertical rows. Then I have 4 6-inch blocks in the middle that'll go between the duck, the grandmother's flower garden, and I've forgotten the name of the block above it. I've sewn those together, and then the 3 12-inch blocks below the duck are all sewn together. I haven't pressed anything anywhere yet because I haven't decided which way I need my seams to go. Once I figure that out, I'll tell you. So my next step is going to be to sew the top section with the duck, the 4 6-inch blocks, and the other 2 12-inch blocks on the other side together into a unit. I sewed the upper center section together. So what I ended up doing was on the 12-inch blocks, I pressed toward the grandmother's flower garden. On the 6-inch blocks, I pressed up toward the top. And then the seam between those two rows, I pressed open. There was just too many points. And then I sewed the duck on, and on that side I pressed the seam toward the duck. So my next step is going to be to add those 3 12-inch blocks at the bottom onto that unit. On my bottom row of 12-inch blocks, I pressed in toward the Dresden plate, and then I added that bottom row to my top section with the duck in it and the grandmother's flower garden and the rest of it. After I sewed it together, I pressed the seam down, which means that I press the seams down going all the way on the left side, and it's actually pressed down on the right side as well. So my next pieces to add are going to be my side borders because I made them the shortest. If you made your top and bottom borders the shortest, then those would go on first. And I haven't pressed my seams on my side borders yet. Since I pressed the center section seams down, I'm going to press the side border seams up, and then I will add them to both sides. My side strips are sewn on, so all I have left for my center of my quilt is my top and bottom borders. At this point, my seams are going all different ways in the center, so I'm going to leave you hanging and say press whichever way you want. You could look and see which way you have your seams going and press your rows correctly. You could press all to one side, you can press open. It's up to you. It's on my design wall. Really crooked, but it isn't a crooked quilt. I sewed my top and bottom rows on, and I pressed the seams in toward the center because I was hoping there were fewer intersections there. And now I am ready to start on the border. In your kit this month, you have 2 pieces of white, one is longer than the other one, and a piece of red. It is not quite as long as the pattern says because you did not need that long a piece. So from each of the white pieces, we are going to cut strips the long way that are 6.5 inches wide, and from the red, so 2 pieces out of each of the white, from the red we are going to cut 4 strips, again the long way, that are 5.25 inches wide. On both white pieces I've opened it out flat, and I happen to have one that has the fold from the fabric. About 1/3 of you will have the fold and about 2/3 won't. If it bothers you, go ahead and press it out. I'm not going to worry about it because I'm going to cut it off. So I have folded it in half once because I had a single layer the long way. And then I'm going to fold it again, and the reason I'm doing that is because my ruler is not long enough to reach all the way. You're going to want to be careful that this is straight, because if you get odd folds in it, you'll have zigzag edges. So it doesn't really matter which white one you're doing. We're going to do the same thing to both of them. I'm going to clean cut one edge. So I've lined up a line with the fold here. I'm going to cut. And then I need to cut off a 6.5 inch wide strip from that. I'm using a square ruler because my long ruler is not 6.5 inches wide. So I have the 6.5 inch mark here on my clean cut edge. Again, I'm running a line along the fold. Whoops, that's not 6.5, that's 8.5. Don't want to do that. If you do that, you'll not have enough fabric, and I do not have enough extra right now to fix mistakes. We'll order more, but it probably will not be in by the time we have our last class. So I'm going to cut, and just because I have the crease, I'm going to go ahead and clean cut this other edge and work from there so that I don't have to deal with my crease. So again, I have a line on my fold. Sorry if I'm blocking the view. I'm going to clean cut and then cut a 6.5 inch strip. And if you have a space where you can walk around, that would be ideal, or you could turn your mat and cut. So I will do the exact same thing on the other white piece so that I end up with 4 6.5 inch strips. 2 of them will be shorter and 2 will be a little longer. For my red piece, I need to cut 4 5.25 inch strips from the length of the fabric. Now, none of you are going to have a crease this time because I split the fabric on the crease, but you will all have a selvage. So make sure you cut that off before you start cutting. So I can use the long ruler for that. Actually, I can use the long ruler for everything because it's 5.25. So I've lined up a line with my fold. I folded this carefully so that it would stay straight, meaning I kept all the selvages together and lined it up. And then I'm going to move my ruler to 5.25 on the edge that I just clean cut. And cut. And I'll move over and do that again. And I will just keep repeating that until I have my 4 strips. The pattern has a scalloped border. I can hear some of you groaning already. If you don't want to do this, make your own border, that's okay. So the pattern says to cut your freezer paper. It was 6.5 inches by the length, a certain length, and then trace. I didn't bother with cutting it because if I had cut 6.5 inches wide, then what I would have had was just another couple inches above the top of my scallop that I would be cutting off, and it doesn't serve any purpose. So what I did is I started on one end of my freezer paper. I marked a straight line, and I lined up lines with my ruler and marked on both ends, on both the top and bottom border and on the side borders. Our first mark from that is 6.25 inches. So I lined up a line along, I'm using the straight edge of my freezer paper. Along the straight edge of my freezer paper, I lined up the 6.25 here and I marked a line. And then for the top and bottom borders, there are 8 sections between the 6.25 on one end and the 6.25 on the other end that are 6 inches. So now I just lined up my 6 inch mark, a line along the straight edge of my freezer paper, and put a mark. So I kept going until I had 8 for the top and bottom border, 6 inch apart marks. And then you're just going to trace. This one's actually the side one. So this is the top and bottom one. So for the top and bottom one on both ends, where it's 6.25, we're going to be putting the corner. Now, what I lined up when I was tracing was my valleys. So I lined up this valley and this valley with my vertical lines. And I lined up this edge with my straight edge of my freezer paper, and I traced. So it would have just been like this. I really don't care what's out here. Again, I'm going to be cutting it off. So I just want to get those valleys lined up. So I would trace this section and this one, and then I would just move it over to the next section, and again, I'm lining up my valleys, or the points, and the bottom edge, and tracing. So on this, the top and bottom, you have the corners. On the side borders, again, and I don't know, you may take this out of here. Again, I'm going to start with the 6 1/4 mark. Then I have 6 inch sections, and I end with another 6 1/4 because on the side, my starting and ending scallop needs to have a seam allowance. So now what I will do is cut out my pattern on the lines. Now if you're going to do the turn to the freezer paper like we did when we did the frame around the duck, you would need 2 of each of these. I'm not going to do it that way. There's too much freezer paper in here and it's just going to be bulky and in the way. So I'm going to try a different method. I'll show you what it is, but you can use whatever method you want. I mentioned I wasn't going to do freezer paper exactly the same way as last time, but I traced my patterns and cut them out of the freezer paper. So this time what I'm going to do is iron the freezer paper, or press it, to the front side of my red strip. So I'm lining the straight edge up along one edge. I want to make sure that I'm leaving enough to cut and allow a seam allowance, but I don't need to center this on the red because once I cut it out, it really doesn't matter whether I centered it or not. So just make sure that whichever piece you're putting on, you're allowing for your seam allowance. Put it on, and then what I'm going to do is come back with a pencil, and I'm going to just trace along the edge of the pattern right here. And then I will cut it, I will peel the freezer paper off and cut out my piece 1/4 of an inch away from that marking. I've cut out my red, and now I found the center of my white piece and of my red piece. If you're sewing the pieces on that don't have a corner on the end, then you're going to be sewing them onto the shortest length of white, and that's the sides. If you have the corner in it, then you're going to be sewing it on to the longest one. So now all I need to do is line up my long straight raw edges, and then I'm going to pin all along the edges. I'm going to applique. I want enough in there that it's not going to shift on me. So when I go to applique this, because you don't need to watch me pin all this, I marked it with a pencil. So what I'm doing is as I go, I'm turning this edge under just enough so that my pencil mark doesn't show. When I get to the deep valleys, I will take a clip in almost to the point and turn it, and other than that, it's just needle turn, just like I showed you with the freezer paper. You just don't have the freezer paper to turn to. I've appliqued all 4 borders, so now I'm ready to sew them on. Before I can do that, my 2 side borders I need to trim down to 48.5 inches, and my top and bottom borders are going to be trimmed down to 60.5 inches. This is one of the top and bottom borders. I have folded it in half, and I made sure it's centered, and then down on this end I put the fold on the 0 line on my cutting mat. And I did line up my edges that are matched up along a line on my cutting mat. So this one I'm cutting at 60.5, so half of 60 is 30, but I need a half. So I'm lining up, the 1/4 inch mark on my ruler with the 30 line on my mat. And I want to make sure that it's straight. When I'm happy, I'm just going to cut off that little bit of extra. Now, for the side borders, you're trimming those to 48.5, so I would be lining up my 0 mark down on the one end, and I'd be coming to the 24 mark, putting my 1/4 inch mark on the 24 line on my cutting mat, and trimming. I sewed the side borders onto the quilt, and then I pressed out toward the borders, and then my last step for finishing up the top before I quilt it is to sew my top and bottom borders on. And again, I will press away from the center toward the borders. I sewed my top and bottom borders on, I pressed away from the center toward the border, and now my quilt is ready to be quilted. My quilt is quilted and bound, and if you want to, you can stop there. But in your kit are 36 large squares of fabric and 24 small squares of fabric, and they are for making yo-yos. So the large squares, the orange yo-yo maker from Clover is the size you want, and the small squares, the green one is the one you want. If you choose not to do these, that's okay. It's your quilt. Here's my finished quilt. I did not do a demonstration on how to make yo-yos because I did that earlier this year, so you can go back and look at that video if you need to. I sewed the yo-yos on just like I would sew on a button, so I just came through the center. You could certainly applique around them if you don't want them to be dimensional where they can pop up. But that's it. You can put the yo-yos on or not. I think it would also be cool if you just cut circles and appliqued them down in those spots, and then you wouldn't have the dimension. Thanks for joining me this year. The new First Thursday Mystery will start the first Thursday in October. The deadline for sign up is September 7, although if you manage to get in a day or two after that, I'm sure you would be accepted. Thanks.